They say a judge is supposed to be the symbol of justice, the one person in the courtroom you can count on to stand above lies, secrets, and crime. But what happens when the man behind the gavel becomes a criminal himself? On a crisp autumn morning, reporters crowded the courthouse steps in a small Midwestern city, cameras flashing wildly. Their lenses weren't pointed at a newly convicted felon or at a notorious gang member in shackles. No, their target was Judge Raymond Carter, a man who, for nearly 3 decades, had worn the black robe with pride, lecturing defendants about morality, discipline, and the law. This morning, he wasn't walking into the courthouse to preside. He was being escorted out, handcuffed, his face pale and his reputation in ruins. The charge? Murder. The victim? His brand-new bride, Isabella. But even that shocking headline was only the beginning, because buried beneath the bloodstains and legal paperwork was a secret so explosive, so disturbing, that it sent an entire nation into heated debate. Isabella wasn't just his wife. She was also his estranged son, Adrian, who had transitioned years earlier and returned under a new identity. What began as a love story late in life ended in a homicide that exposed the darkest corners of pride, prejudice, and family shame. Imagine the betrayal felt when police and prosecutors piece it all together. A respected judge who preached family values from the bench was hiding the most twisted family tragedy of them all. He didn't just kill a partner in a crime of passion. He killed his own flesh and blood to bury a truth he couldn't face. The case would grip the country, not only because of its gruesome details, but because it challenged every image the public had of the man in the robe. How could the person trusted to hand out life sentences be capable of something so brutal? How could a father, a man sworn to protect justice, justify slaughtering his own child on the night of their wedding? This story isn't just about murder. It's about secrets, the kind that fester in the dark, the kind that can corrode love, dignity, and even sanity. It's about the deadly collision between public image and private truth. And it's about how one man's refusal to accept reality turned a house of celebration into a crime scene. By the end of this case, the name Raymond Carter would no longer be spoken with reverence. It would be spat with disgust. A cautionary tale of what happens when pride and prejudice are stronger than love and humanity. Over the next hour, we're going to unpack every detail. How a respected judge with everything to lose fell for a mysterious woman half his age. How wedding bells turned to bloodshed in a single night. And how detectives uncovered a hidden identity that shattered not just a family, but an entire community's trust. This is the story of Judge Raymond Carter, his bride Isabella, and the secret that led to murder. Before the mugshots, before the headlines, before the nation knew his name for all the wrong reasons, Judge Raymond Carter was a kind of man people trusted. For nearly 30 years, he sat in that high-backed leather chair, robe-pressed, gavel-polished, and voice-steady. In the courtroom, he was the law itself. Raymond wasn't born into privilege. He grew up in a modest working-class home, son of a factory worker and a schoolteacher. Neighbors described him as the kid who always carried a book under his arm, and the boy who never got into trouble. By the time he finished law school, it was clear he was destined for the bench. To his community, he embodied discipline, morality, and a sharp sense of justice. On the bench, Carter became known for his fiery speeches. He didn't just hand out sentences. He handed out lectures. To the young drug dealer in front of him, he'd say, "You didn't just break the law. You broke the trust of your mother." To the husband caught cheating welfare benefits, "A man who deceived the system will deceive his family. And what's a man without integrity?" The local press loved him. The moral compass of the court. One headline called him. Church groups invited him to speak at banquets. Parents pointed to him as proof that discipline and hard work paid off. But behind the carefully polished reputation, Raymond's life was less than perfect. His wife, Eleanor, had died of cancer a decade earlier. The couple had only one child, Adrian, a boy Raymond had tried to raise in his own stern image. Adrian was sensitive, artistic, never quite fitting into the rigid mold his father demanded. Their relationship grew strained through high school, and by the time Adrian left for college, the distance between them was more than miles. Raymond rarely spoke about his son in public. Colleagues noticed that when family was mentioned, he'd pivot to talking about work. Some whispered that Adrian had run off, others that there had been a falling out. The truth, of course, was deeper and darker. Adrian had come out as transgender in his early 20s, and Raymond, upholder of traditional values, couldn't accept it. Heated arguments turned into years of silence. Eventually, it was as though Adrian had vanished completely from his father's life. For Raymond, the solution was simple: bury the past. Pretend the boy no longer existed. He threw himself deeper into his career, doubling down on public speeches about morality and the sanctity of family. The louder the applause, the easier it was to ignore the hollow quiet of his own house. Still, the cracks were visible if you looked closely. At social events, he often arrived alone. Friends noticed he lingered at the bar a little too long before delivering his polished remarks. One former clerk recalled, "He was always talking about how the country had lost its values, but when you looked in his eyes, you saw loneliness. A man who wanted something he couldn't admit out loud." As the years rolled by, Raymond grew weary. He was approaching 60, still strong on the bench, but tired in his personal life. The public saw a man in control. The truth? He was a widower with a bitter estrangement from his only child. A man whose nights were spent in an empty house filled with framed awards and no laughter. That was the stage on which Isabella entered his life. She appeared at a charity fundraiser one spring evening, elegant and composed, her smile lighting up the ballroom. To friends and colleagues, she seemed almost too perfect for him. Half his age, glamorous, but attentive in a way that made Raymond feel alive again. Where others saw a stern, aging judge, she looked at him with admiration. Where others heard lectures, she laughed at his stories. For the first time in years, Raymond let his guard down. He took her to dinner. He showed her the city from the courthouse balcony. Soon, he was introducing her at public events, his hand firmly clasping hers, the image of a man who had finally found happiness again. The whispers began immediately. Isn't she a bit young for him? Do you think she's after his money? Some wonder how long it would last. But to Raymond, none of that mattered. For a man who built his life around rules, Isabella felt like freedom. She filled the empty spaces Eleanor had left behind. She filled the silence Adrian had carved out. To the outside world, Judge Carter's life looked flawless again. The lonely widower had been given a second chance at love. A highly publicized wedding was announced, lavish, traditional, with society photographers lining the church steps. It was a picture-perfect comeback story. The stern judge finally rewarded with joy. What no one knew, not his colleagues, not his neighbors, not even closest friends who toasted champagne at his wedding, was that the woman walking down the aisle in white lace carried the very secret he had spent years trying to erase. And that secret was about to turn his so-called perfect life into a nightmare. When Isabella first entered Judge Carter's world, it seemed almost scripted, like a scene from one of the courtroom dramas he secretly admired on late-night television. It was spring, the city's annual charity gala buzzing with wealthy donors, attorneys, and community leaders. The kind of event where Raymond Carter was always a centerpiece, shaking hands, giving speeches, posing for photos under glittering chandeliers. But that evening, the spotlight shifted. Across the room, standing near the silent auction table with a glass of champagne in hand, was a woman who seemed to carry her own kind of spotlight. She was tall, poised, with long dark hair falling in soft waves around her shoulders. Her dress shimmered under the lights, But it wasn't just beauty that drew attention. It was the confidence. She stood as though the entire gala existed for her, and yet her smile carried a warmth that softened the edges of intimidation. Her name was Isabella. Introduced casually by a mutual acquaintance, Isabella greeted Raymond with a handshake that lingered a beat too long. She listened intently as he spoke, laughed easily at his dry humor, and leaned in with an intimacy that made the 60-year-old judge feel something he hadn't felt in decades, desired. For weeks afterward, Raymond found himself thinking about her. He invited her to dinner. She accepted without hesitation. Soon, their encounter stretched beyond charity galas and fundraising dinners. They were seen at cozy Italian restaurants, strolling hand in hand through city parks, and attending Sunday service side by side. To anyone watching, it looked like a whirlwind romance, unlikely but oddly enchanting. Whispers began immediately. She's half his age. Do you think she's after his money? He's a judge. She's who exactly? Isabella's past was a blank slate. No one could quite place her family, her career, or where she'd come from. She said she had worked in non-profit circles, that she spent time abroad, that she was ready to settle down and start a family. It was vague, but her charm smoothed over the details. And Raymond didn't press. He didn't want to. For a man who had built his career demanding answers, he seemed strangely uninterested in questions. It was enough that Isabella made him feel alive. When she laughed, when she touched his hand, when she looked at him like he was the only man in the room. Those were things no cross-examination could quantify. Within months, their romance became public. Colleagues at the courthouse raised eyebrows. Some admired his newfound energy. Others smirked behind closed doors, wondering how long it would last. But Raymond didn't care. For the first time in years, he didn't walk into a banquet alone. He didn't sit at church with an empty pew beside him. He had Isabella, and she had him completely. The proposal was private but extravagant. A candlelit dinner, a velvet box slipped across the table, and a ring that gleamed under the low light. Isabella said yes with tears in her eyes, embracing him with the fervor of a woman who seemed ready to build forever. The wedding was set for the following fall. It was a spectacle, lavish, traditional, and drenched in symbolism. Raymond wore his black tuxedo like a second skin. Isabella floated down the aisle in a lace gown that shimmered in candlelight. The church bells rang as the city's elite filled the pews. Reporters lingered outside, eager to capture the image of the stern judge finally rewarded with love. To the public, it was a perfect story. The widower who found joy again, the man of justice granted a second chance at happiness. The photographs told the tale. Raymond smiling, Isabella glowing, their hands intertwined as though destiny had pulled them together. But if anyone looked closely, if anyone had been paying attention, there were cracks in the fairy tale. At the rehearsal dinner, Isabella had excused herself suddenly, locking herself in the bathroom for nearly 20 minutes. When she returned, her eyes were red, her smile forced. A bridesmaid later whispered she'd heard muffled sobs. At the reception, one of Raymond's colleagues asked casually about her parents. Isabella's answer was quick, rehearsed, almost offensive. They passed away years ago. She changed the subject immediately. And then there was her insistence on keeping certain parts of her life private. No family at the wedding. No old friends from her childhood. Just a handful of newer acquaintances. People who couldn't confirm much about who she had been before. To Raymond, none of that mattered. He brushed off the whispers, ignored the doubts. His loneliness had been replaced by companionship, and that was all he cared about. As the guests danced late into the night, the judge and his bride cut their cake, kissed under flashing cameras, and drove away in a limousine that glittered with the words, "Just married," scrawled in white paint across the rear window. Behind those tinted glass windows, however, sat not just a newlywed couple. They carried a secret far heavier than confetti raining down on the church steps. Raymond Carter believed he had found love. What he didn't realize was that the woman by his side carried the very truth he had spent years burying. And that truth would surface on their wedding night, with blood. The wedding had ended like something out of a fairy tale. The limousine pulled away from the church, tin cans rattling across the pavement, guests cheering as confetti fluttered in the air. Judge Raymond Carter leaned back against the leather seat. His new bride rested her head on his shoulder. For a man who had spent decades lecturing others on how to live, this felt like redemption. At last, he wasn't just a widower in a black robe. He was a husband again. The reception blurred into memory. Champagne toasts, applause, flashbulbs. But the night was far from over. Their honeymoon suite waited. An elegant brick townhouse Raymond had purchased in a historic neighborhood. The kind of home meant to start fresh chapters. Isabella had gushed when he first showed it to her. "It feels like a place where we could build a future," she'd said. As midnight drew near, the couple entered the dimly lit house. Candles flickered on the mantel. A chill bottle of wine sat waiting. For once, Raymond felt younger, hopeful. He kissed Isabella at the door, carrying her across the threshold with surprising strength for a man his age. Upstairs, the master bedroom glowed softly under lamplight. White rose petals covered the bedspread, and music hummed low in the background. Everything seemed perfect, but perfect wouldn't last. While Isabella freshened up in the bathroom, Raymond wandered the room, savoring the silence. He adjusted his cufflinks, loosened his tie, then noticed something unusual, a small leather valise half tucked beneath the dresser. It wasn't her usual handbag. This looked older, worn, almost forgotten. Curiosity tugged at him. Maybe it was a judge in him, the instinct to investigate, to uncover. He pulled the valise out and flicked open the clasp. Inside lay neatly stacked documents. A passport, medical records, photographs. At first, nothing seemed odd, until his eyes caught a name printed in bold letters on a birth certificate. Adrian Michael Carter. His chest tightened. The last name hit like a hammer. Carter. His name. Hands trembling. He flipped through the papers. A faded high school photo. Adrian, thin, dark-eyed. The son he hadn't seen in more than a decade. Another folder. Surgical reports, hormone therapy notes, updated identification under a new name. Isabella Carter. The room began to spin. In that moment, reality slammed into him. The woman he had just married, the bride who kissed him under church bells, wasn't just a stranger with mysterious past. She was his child, the son he had disowned, the boy who had run away and never looked back, the boy who had returned as a woman, now his wife. Raymond staggered back, the documents scattering across the floor, his face flushed hot, then cold, betrayal twisted in his gut, followed quickly by rage. He felt sick, disoriented, humiliated, furious. How dare she come back like this? How dare she deceive him, make him a fool? In his mind, it wasn't just Isabella's secret. It was an attack. A calculated humiliation designed to destroy everything he stood for. When Isabella stepped out of the bathroom moments later, she found him clutching the papers in his hands. The smile on her face froze. "Raymond," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Please, let me explain." But he didn't want explanations. His mind raced with images of headlines, courtroom whispers, reporters circling like vultures. Judge Carter marries his own son. His entire career, his reputation, his carefully built image. It would all collapse in an instant. He advanced on her, his voice low but shaking with fury. "You lied to me. You lied to God. You are not my wife. You are my shame." Isabella tried to reach for him, pleading, "I didn't want to hurt you. I just wanted a chance for you to see me, to love me." Her words only fueled his rage. In that moment, reason left him. He was no longer the judge, no longer the man of law. He was a father consumed by pride and fear, unwilling to let the world know his truth. On the dresser sat a heavy brass candlestick, polished for the occasion. In a blind fury, Raymond seized it. Isabella backed away, her voice cracking as she begged, "Please, Dad." But the word Dad was the final spark. He swung. The first blow sent her crashing to the floor. She screamed, shielding herself, but he didn't stop, blow after blow, until the petals on the bedspread were soaked red and the music in the background seemed grotesquely cheerful. When it was over, Isabella lay motionless, her face bruised, blood pooling into the rug. Raymond dropped the candlestick, panting. The reality of what he had done set in. His bride was dead. His secret, the secret he had buried for years, was scattered across the floor, illuminated by the soft yellow lamplight. Frantically, he tried to clean the scene. He staged it clumsily, scattering drawers, breaking a window to mimic a break-in. He washed his hands, shoved the documents back into the valise, and stuffed it into the closet. But the mess was too great, the cover-up too thin. Neighbors would later say they heard nothing unusual that night, only the faint sound of music drifting from the Carter house. But behind those walls, a judge who spent his life demanding truth had committed the ultimate lie. By morning, the honeymoon suite was a crime scene, and the secret he had killed to protect was about to be uncovered. The morning after the wedding should have been filled with breakfast in bed, honeymoon laughter, and the soft glow of a new beginning. Instead, police sirens wailed outside the Carter residence, red and blue lights flickering across the pristine townhouse. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains, stunned whispers passing between them. The judge's new white dead? Inside, chaos had given way procedure. Officers marked off the home with yellow tape. The air was thick with the coppery scent of blood, now mingled with the sterile tang of latex gloves and fingerprint powder. Detective Carla Hughes, a seasoned investigator with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, stepped onto the scene. She had handled homicide before, but this one was different. The victim wasn't just another name in the city's endless crime ledger. The suspect, if whispers were true, was a man who had sentenced countless criminals from the very same courthouse she worked with. The official story, as relayed by Raymond Carter, was simple: a break-in gone wrong. He told the first responding officers that he had been asleep downstairs when he heard noises. By the time he reached the bedroom, he claimed Isabella was already gone, attacked by an intruder who fled through the broken window. But almost immediately, Hughes sensed the story didn't fit. The broken window had shards scattered outside the frame, not inside, suggesting it had been smashed from within. No signs of forced entry on the doors. The drawers pulled open looked staged, their contents too neatly spilled. Jewelry and cash lay untouched. Whoever did this, if it was a burglar, had ignored the very things burglars come for. And then there was Carter himself. When Hughes questioned him, he spoke in the measured tones of a man used to being listened to, not interrogated. He repeated the break-in narrative calmly, too calmly, as though reading from a script. But his hands told another story. Slight tremors, faint scratches along his knuckles, a bandage marked near his wrist. Forensics began their sweep. Dr. Elaine Chun, the medical examiner, arrived to examine the body. Isabella lay where she had fallen, her wedding dress torn, white fabric now stained deep crimson, multiple blunt force injuries to the head, defensive wounds along her forearms. She fought hard, Dr. Chin murmured, shaking her head. The candlestick, hastily wiped but still bearing traces of blood, was bagged as evidence. Fingerprint dusting revealed partial smears consistent with cleaning attempts. Then came the discovery that shifted everything. In a closet off the master bedroom, crime scene techs found a leather valise shoved behind a row of coats. Inside, documents, birth certificate, medical records, photographs. Detective Hughes flipped through the file, her brow furrowing with each page. Adrian Michael Carter. Hormone therapy reports. Legal name change. Isabella Carter. She paused, stunned. The victim wasn't just the judge's wife. She was a estranged child, returned under a new identity. The implications were staggering. A father who had condemned his child's choices, reunited under false pretenses, now standing over a body on their wedding night. Hughes knew she had to tread carefully. This wasn't just a homicide. It was about to become a political and social firestorm. Back at the precinct, whispers spread fast. Officers huddled in corners, exchanging theories. Some couldn't believe a man like Carter could be capable of murder. Others shook their heads, saying it explained everything. The stage scene, the too-perfect alibi, the motive rooted in shame and secrecy. Meanwhile, reporters camped outside the courthouse, catching wind of tragedy. At first, headlines read, "Judge's bride slain in honeymoon attack." But within hours, details from leaks trickled out. Suspicious evidence, inconsistencies in Carter's story. Detective Hughes sat across from Carter in the interrogation room. No robe now, no gavel, just a weary man in a rumpled shirt. She pressed him gently but firmly. "Your story doesn't match the evidence, Judge. The window wasn't broken from the outside. Nothing was stolen. The candlestick has your prints." Carter's jaw tightened. "I told you I was downstairs. I heard the noise too late." Hughes slid the valise across the table, the birth certificate visible beneath the clear plastic evidence bag. "And what about this? Did you know your wife was also your son?" For the first time, his composure cracked. His eyes darted away, lips pressing into a thin line. He muttered something about betrayal, about humiliation. Hughes leaned in. "You need to be honest, because right now everything points to you." Outside the room, Dr. Chen's preliminary autopsy notes only strengthened the case. The angle of the blows, the consistency of the force, they all suggested the killer was someone close, someone in control, not a panic burglar. Isabella's defensive wounds told of a struggle, but not against a stranger, against someone she trusted enough to let her guard down. By the end of the day, detectives had enough to shift Carter's status from grieving husband to prime suspect. His fingerprints on the weapon, his implausible story, the damning discovery of Isabella's true identity, providing a motive tie to pride, shame, and the desperate need to protect an image. The community, once proud of their moral compass judge, now braced for scandal. The investigation had only just begun, but already one truth was clear. The walls of Raymond Carter's carefully constructed life were crumbling. The man who had spent years demanding honesty in his courtroom was now drowning in lies of his own making. And the world was about to find out. News of a slain bride is enough to make headlines in any small city. But when that bride was married to one of the most respected judges in the state, and when her killer was suspected to be the judge himself, the story exploded like wildfire. By the second day after Isabella's death, the courthouse steps were swarming with reporters. Headlines shifted from polite shock, "Judge's bride murdered in honeymoon horror," to darker speculation. Inconsistencies in Judge's story raised questions. Satellite trucks parked along the street, microphones thrust at anyone who had ever shaken Carter's hand. And then the real bombshell dropped. Leaked documents from the investigation began circulating. The valise, the birth certificate, the medical records. By the evening news cycle, the secret was out. Isabella, the glamorous young bride, wasn't who the public thought she was. She was Adrian Carter, the estranged son of Judge Raymond Carter, who had transitioned years earlier. The narrative flipped instantly. This was no longer a simple domestic tragedy. It was a scandal that combined sex, secrecy, family betrayal, and murder, all under the shadow of a man who had once stood as the community's moral authority. The public reaction was electric and divided. Some were horrified. Vigils sprang up almost overnight, candles and flowers laid outside the courthouse with signs reading #Justice for Isabella. LGBTQ plus advocacy groups marched in the streets, denouncing Carter not just as a murderer, but as a symbol of the dangers of prejudice and hypocrisy. They painted murals of Isabella's smiling face, framed in rainbow colors, declaring, "Her truth was not a crime. His violence was." Others, however, clung to Carter's image as the stern father figure of the community. A small but vocal group insisted he had been tricked, that he was a victim of deception. On talk radio and social media, callers raged. How could she lie to him like that? Any man would snap. These voices framed the murder not as cold-blooded, but as a tragic accident of passion. The community split down the middle, with courthouse rallies turning into shouting matches. On one side, supporters demanded accountability. A robe doesn't put you above the law. On the other, defenders argued he was provoked. Don't destroy his life over one mistake. Meanwhile, the media couldn't get enough. National outlets picked up the case, broadcasting primetime specials. Tabloids splashed lurid headlines. Killer judge marries his own son, and from gavel to gravestone, the Carter family secret. Talk shows debated late into the night, pitting legal analysts against psychologists, pastors against activists. Everyone had an opinion, and everyone wanted to be heard. Inside the courthouse, the weight of it all was unbearable. Colleagues who once admired Carter now spoke in hushed tones. Some judges publicly distanced themselves, emphasizing that no one is above the law. Prosecutors whispered that this would be the trial of the decade. Detective Carla Hughes, normally unfazed by media storms, admitted to colleagues that she had never seen anything like it. "It's not just a murder case anymore," she said. "It's a cultural war." The strain showed on Carter himself. Paparazzi photos captured him being escorted into preliminary hearings, head lowered, his once imposing frame shrinking under the weight of humiliation. The robe was gone. In its place, a wrinkled suit, handcuffs glinting under the camera flashes. For Isabella, however, there was no voice left but the evidence. Friends and acquaintances began to come forward, people who had known her in recent years but had never connected her to the judge. They described her as kind, ambitious, eager to reconcile with her past. One friend recalled, "She told me she was going to do something brave, face her father again. I had no idea what she meant." That revelation reframed everything. To many, Isabella wasn't a deceiver. She was a daughter desperate to bridge the chasm with her father, even if it meant disguising her truth at first. And for that attempt, she had paid the ultimate price. By the end of the month, the story had grown larger than the city itself. Editorials ran in national papers. Commentators called it a turning point in conversations about identity, prejudice, and family violence. But beyond the debates and hashtags, one fact remained undeniable. A woman was dead, killed on the night that should have been the beginning of her life. And the man accused was no ordinary suspect. He was a judge who had built his career condemning others for their sins. The secret was out. The court of public opinion had already rendered its verdict. Now, the legal system would have to decide his fate. By the time Judge Raymond Carter's trial began, the courthouse had become a fortress. Barricades lined the sidewalks, satellite trucks stacked shoulder to shoulder, and protesters waved signs on both sides of the cultural divide. #Justice for Isabella banners hung beside posters reading "Carter was tricked." The air outside buzzed like a battlefield. The inside was tense as a powder keg. The prosecution team, led by Assistant District Attorney Carlingwin, walked into court knowing this was no ordinary case. This wasn't just about proving a murder. It was about showing the public that even the most powerful man in the system could be held accountable. Nguyen's opening statement was sharp and unflinching. The defendant, Judge Raymond Carter, is not above the law. On the very night he should have celebrated love, he chose violence. He didn't just kill his wife. He killed his own child. And he did it to protect an image of himself that he knew was already a lie. The defense countered with a carefully scripted narrative. Carter's lead attorney, Samuel Breyer, painted his client as a man blindsided by a deception so profound that it shattered his sanity. This was not premeditated murder, Breyer argued. This was the tragic reaction of a father misled, betrayed, and humiliated. He urged the jury to see Carter not as a monster, but as a broken man caught in a web of lies. But the evidence told a different story. For 30 years, Raymond Carter told others to face the truth. But when the truth came into his own home, he chose to kill it. He chose to kill her. And now it is time that he faces justice, not as a judge, but as a murderer. Deliberation stretched into 2 days. Outside, protesters camped on the courthouse lawn, chanting late into the night. When the jury finally filed back in, the atmosphere was electric. Reporters scribbled, cameras rolled, and the entire city seemed to hold its breath. The foreperson stood. We, the jury, find the defendant, Raymond Carter, guilty of murder in the first degree. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Supporters of Isabella wept openly, clutching each other in relief. Carter slumped in his chair, eyes vacant, as if the gavel of justice he had wielded for so long had finally struck him down. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The irony was not lost on anyone. The man who had spent decades sending others to prison would now die behind bars himself. As deputies led him away, Carter glanced back once at the packed courtroom, his world of authority and power gone in an instant. The robe was gone, the bench gone, the respect gone. What remained was the title the headlines had already branded him with, "The Killer Judge." The trial was over, but the echoes of its verdict would linger for years. When the verdict was read, the case of Judge Raymond Carter closed in a courtroom sense. But outside those four walls, the story had only just begun to echo. The once respected judge was led away in chains, his name forever stripped of honor. His portrait, which once hung proudly in the courthouse hallway, was quietly removed. Colleagues who had once toasted his speeches now refused to even speak his name. The very institution he had represented turned its back on him, determined to prove that the justice system could hold even its own accountable. For Isabella, the silence she left behind was deafening. She was laid to rest under her chosen name, her gravestone engraved with the words, "Beloved Daughter." The funeral drew mourners from across the community, friends, activists, and even strangers who felt compelled to honor a life cut short. Candles flickered in vigils across the city, and murals painted her face in vibrant colors. The hashtag Justice for Isabella spread nationwide, transforming her from a victim into a symbol of resilience. But not everyone saw it the same way. Carter's defenders continued to argue in hushed corners and talk radio segments that he had been provoked, that he was a man deceived. Their voices didn't vanish, but they grew fainter as the weight of the evidence and the brutality of the crime settled in. Over time, the louder story became not about deception, but about prejudice and pride, the kind that could turn a father against his own child. In prison, Carter became an outcast among inmates. He was despised not only for his crime, but for the years he had spent handing down harsh sentences from the bench. Gone was the authority of the robe. In its place was a man reduced to a number, spending his days in a cell he could never escape. The trial left ripples that reached far beyond one courthouse. Advocacy groups cited Isabella's case as a rallying cry for better protections for transgender individuals. Schools held assemblies, churches hosted painful but necessary conversations, and lawmakers debated how families and institutions could confront prejudice before it turned deadly. Detective Carla Hughes, reflecting years later, said it best, "I've seen a lot of murders, but this wasn't just about blood. It was about pride. A man who cared more about his image than his daughter's life. That's what killed her. And that, perhaps, is the most haunting lesson of all. Secrets have a way of festering. Pride has a way of poisoning love. And when denial becomes stronger than compassion, tragedy often follows. The name Judge Raymond Carter will never again be spoken with respect. But Isabella's name endures, not as a scandal, but as a reminder that truth deserves to live in the light, that no life should be cut short because of who they are. In the end, the man who had once sentenced others to life in prison received that very sentence himself. The robe was gone, the gavel silenced. Justice, at last, was served, not for the judge, but for Isabella, and her story remains a cautionary tale. That love denied can turn deadly, that secrets kill, and that even the highest seat of judgment cannot shield someone from a truth.